Boundaries are not always about saying no. Oftentimes, they're about staying effective, staying efficient, providing guidelines for others and how to treat us. And it's about protecting your peace because boundaries are often viewed as negative. People think there's something wrong when you set boundaries, but that's just not the case because boundaries are important. You see, high performers don't resist boundaries because they're weak. They might resist boundaries because they're committed. They have this innate desire to be seen as reliable. And sometimes we view boundaries as, well, I'm not reliable because I keep saying things like no. And that's not the case because boundaries aren't always about saying no. Sometimes it's about saying, not right now. And you see, unprotected commitment leads to burnout, meaning boundaries help protect our time, protect the things you're already committed to, so that you can get those things done without the symptoms of burnout, right? Remember the last couple of videos we talked about burnout shows up as that brain fog, that decision fatigue, that exhaustion, or that difficulty focusing. And if you're not protecting your time to get those things done, you're gonna feel burnt out, which leads to not having that excellence in the work you're doing because you're not effective. And so today I want to focus on why are boundaries more of a performance strategy versus a personal preference? Sometimes they're a personal preference, but when we're talking about work, we're really going to talk about their performance strategy. And so, what I mean by that is often high performers struggle with boundaries because when we mention it's that reliability and availability, right? High performers tend to associate when you get paid and you get praised and you get promoted, it's because you've been available. And that's, I think, a negative connotation to connect it together because yes, being available when we're supposed to be available for work is important, and they do contribute to things such as getting paid, praised, and promoted. But it's not all about being available, right? Because reliability becomes this unspoken contract that the more people see you as reliable, the more they're going to ask you to do, right? We talked about that before. And so think about when you say yes, right? That often feels like more responsibility. It feels like you're a part of the team because you've said yes. And that's true, that can happen because you want to be on a team. You want people to see you as they're communicating with me, they're working with me, and I can trust that they're going to get those things done. And all of that's true. And sometimes you might think that saying no feels risky. And I've heard a lot of times from people, oh, if I say no, I might lose my job. That in itself is a fear that comes out of anxiety or it comes out of your stress response, right? Because I think it depends on how much do you say no, how much do you set a boundary? And and I've talked about boundaries in other videos because boundaries are multifaceted. We can put boundaries around our time and still get the work done and be seen as reliable. And that type of boundary is not going to cause you to lose your job. Staying overtime every day, every week, it should not cost you your job because that is not what you were hired for. You're not hired to work 24/7. And so we have to be cautious and pay attention to what types of boundaries we set. But remember that boundaries might feel risky, but they're important so that you can stay effective. You see, the other challenge with boundaries and why you might avoid them is, are you absorbing the inefficiencies, right? So are you accepting things that might not be the normal standard you would hold it to, especially if you supervise others, but are you allowing it because if you're not having those boundaries, are you getting burnt out, right? And as a leader, you want to be challenging those things that don't make sense. You want to challenge the things that need to be challenged so that you are more efficient and your team runs more efficiently. And so you want to be cautious of what's the purpose of saying yes and what's the purpose of each boundary, because they all serve a purpose. And over functioning might seem like a reward, but in the end, it actually becomes a punishment when your body starts to collapse from that burnout. And so you want to be cautious you're not trying to overfunction all the time. And so there are ways that we can start to shift and come out of boundaries. But first, let's talk about what the cost of those boundaries are, right? What happens to you when you're functioning without boundaries? We've talked about a few of them, but some other things that come up all the time is you might have a lot of cognitive fatigue, right? This becomes chronic because that email that used to take 5 minutes to write now takes you 20. Nobody wants to take more time to write something. Or have you ever had times where you struggle to formulate any executive level sentences, right? Making sure it's at the right level depending on who you're sending it to. And I've seen that a lot, that people will sit at the keyboard and they will just stare at the computer because the sentences they used to form are taking a lot longer to show up. And that's because they're cognitively, they're getting fatigued. They're just tired. And this is what happens when we try and function without boundaries. You might also notice some attention fragmentation, meaning the depth of how much you focus on it, on the attention to detail will disappear, right? So if you're somebody who's very detail oriented, this is where you're going to start to lose sight of the small details. And it's a concern, and it'll probably become a problem and detrimental when those details matter to the job you do. And so you want to make sure that you're really focusing and paying attention on how are things affecting you so that you can continue to move forward. Not having boundaries also impacts your recovery time, meaning the time you dedicated to mentally, emotionally, physically recover, rest, just have downtime often gets consumed by catch up time. Now, I see this a lot in the healthcare field, that what should be personal downtime to detach from work and recover becomes hours and hours of paperwork just to get caught up from the last week. And that's hard. And so it's how much extra are you giving? Because the more you're giving, the longer it's going to take you to get those things done. But remember, you don't have to, right? You don't have to function in this state. And so when we're trying to function without boundaries, boundary free, we often can start to have resentment build up. And this shows up silently, like you're not necessarily aware of it. But as you start to notice it, it's because you're not feeling seen as a person and you feel like you're just another cog in the wheel. And I hear that a lot in healthcare. I'm just another cog in the wheel, and I don't matter. I don't make a difference. And that's a concern, because somebody who's saying that, they're already burnt out. Because when we are boundary free, our performance declines, which means the long-term output does too, right? One follows the other. And so the common myths that come up with boundaries and why we want to shift from functioning boundary free to having boundaries is because boundaries, people think they keep them stuck, right? And a lot of that is because boundaries are often framed as emotional self-care only, right? Have you ever heard, oh, so and so didn't want to come, so they don't like me? Well, not true. They're probably just trying to protect their own energy, and knowing sometimes if you're going to show up, you might not be fully present, and that's okay. We want to make sure that we have peace so that we can still perform well. And a lot of times, peace without performance can still lead to that disengagement, right? Because we can't perform and perform and perform and not feel that peace within yourself. You want to have that peace so that you can keep giving. Because if we don't have peace, we tend to have stress, and stress leads to disengagement, right? And so another myth is that boundaries without strategy creates guilt and inconsistency, which is not true because boundaries are a strategy and it helps people know what they can expect from you. You actually can have more consistency when you have boundaries because the goal is not to withdraw. It is to be sustainable in what you are doing and what you have going on in life. And so strategies and strategic boundaries, remember, they protect your focus, your energy, and your decision quality. So the more you have boundaries that protect these things, the more efficient and effective you're really going to be. And the more people want to be around you and they're going to see you as reliable. And so, how do we make boundaries that actually protect your performance? First of all, you want to really have clarity on your role, meaning what is yours to take care of and what belongs to other people. Because as a leader or a high performer, you can't take it all on yourself because that just puts you into overload. You want to think about time boundaries that protect your ability to do that deep work, to really get into a project or a task and get into all those details so that you can keep going. So when we talk about time boundaries, it's not just about meetings, it's about protecting what do you absolutely need to get done that's important. Meetings are important, but having been in leadership a long time, sometimes there's too many meetings. You can also set emotional boundaries, and these are designed to prevent absorbing unnecessary stress. So, yes, other people want to rely on you if you're a leader. And sometimes I've seen it among coworkers. They support each other, and that support is great. But you want to make sure you have emotional boundaries, which means if you don't feel like or don't think you have the bandwidth to listen and absorb what they're going to share, then maybe that moment is the right time to listen. And so just make sure that you're protecting what's going to help you continue to function and succeed. We also want to think about setting boundaries around your availability. So availability can be viewed one of two ways, right? Most people have a set work schedule, which is predictable. And I recognize in the healthcare field, sometimes it's not predictable, and I've been there. And as a leader, sometimes you have to give into that. But for today's conversation, I want you to think about the standard. What would be the norm, right? Because the other thing that comes up for leaders or high performers is the sense of urgency that everything is urgent. And are we unnecessarily creating this urgency culture? Now, with remote work, I've seen it a lot that all of a sudden everything is urgent, meaning every time there's a ping from the messaging app or an email notification, there's this sense of, "Oh, I've got to respond right now." And that's what I want to challenge is what really constitutes an emergency? Because we need to separate what is an emergency that does require immediate action to say cross a boundary or say yes and step out of the bounds? Or is it not urgent and a crisis and we need to protect that available time, right? And that I think we'll do another video in the future because that sense of urgency comes from anxiety. It's like, I need to be right in the middle, and most things are not urgent. And so the more we function in that, again, if we don't have that boundary, the higher your stress response is going to be. So I want you to think about boundaries as a system, right? It's part of the system we talked about in a previous video. It's not just about willpower. And really, it's not about willpower. It is about using boundaries as part of your system to make sure that you are taking care of yourself, taking care of your nervous system. Because when boundaries fail, we don't have the support for our nervous system. So boundaries help when you're exhausted, right? Because exhausted systems can't enforce boundaries. So boundaries are going to help you make sure that you're not functioning from an exhausted state. And people will often find they default to old patterns when they're under stress. And this is so common because we have one way of constantly functioning and moving through the world. And we have one way that we have learned and become responsive to stress. And that's your default mode, right? It's old patterns. So when we're talking about boundaries to be more effective and efficient and have more peace so that you can have that energy, we have to be cautious that we don't fall into those old patterns under stress. So the more we practice things and make them habits and new routines, then we can change those old patterns. You might also have some guilt and feel like you have to over explain things and think that when you erode boundaries, you don't have integrity. And that's not the case because integrity is about being true to who you are, right? And other people, yes, can say things to make you feel guilty. And that goes back to that need to feel reliable and trusted. But that's not the intent of boundaries. Boundaries are still saying you can trust and rely on me. But to do that during the time I'm giving you, this is the boundary I need because you need that recovery time. So think about boundaries as a capacity issue, not a discipline issue, right? I quickly learned that I always stepped over my own boundaries because I wanted to please people. So I was that yes person, always trying to please people and be supportive because then I felt included. But that's not the case. It's boundaries had to protect my capacity because then emotionally and mentally and physically I could keep doing what I was doing to help them as long as I focused on why do I need the boundary? And that's important. So yes, we might have to discipline ourselves, but really, I want you to think about it as you're protecting your capacity. You have to focus on the capacity within in order to do the job you do. And so, oftentimes, boundaries tend to collapse when stress stays unaddressed. So, and I briefly mentioned that, right? And so, we really want to get to where you can manage that stress so that you have the clarity and the confidence to maintain those boundaries that you've set because you want to do the job that you're called to, and that's important. And so I wrote a document and a guide. It's called Stress to Peace, is a great starting point that really helps you reset, helps you make sure that you are reducing your stress, that you're able to stay at your baseline level where you're energetic and confident and feeling efficient in what you're doing. And so I want to invite you to check it out. Go to stresstopeace.com, get your free guide. It has 3 easy steps to help you start to maintain that energy and that rest so that you can set and maintain your boundaries as you desire. Now, oftentimes some of this might feel like short-term relief. And the one thing I will say about that is that I encourage people just 2 weeks. Anything you take from any of these videos or anybody else, give it an intentional try every day for 2 weeks and see what happens. Because I'm willing to bet you're going to notice some difference. And so remember that boundaries that are designed to align with you can help your performance. They can help sustain your energy and help you lead without self-sacrifice. Because this isn't about doing less. It's actually about doing what matters and doing what matters well. And boundaries don't limit high performers, they actually protect them. When we protect performance, it becomes a strategy. So start with the Stress to Peace guide because excellence requires structure, not self-abandonment. And I want to see you thrive in what you're doing.